Good morning, and welcome to our panel discussion today, Soft Power Encountering Extremism from the Horn of Africa to the Western Sahel. This is a very exciting panel for me to be part of, although I'm a last-minute replacement for Professor Sean Aday. I'm a professor at the School of Media and Public Affairs, and my research is not exactly on this subject, so I'm excited to learn from our esteemed speakers today. I wanted to, in my opening remarks, just sort of talk about what the schedule is for today. And I wanted to start by letting you know that, unfortunately, Alberto Fernandez and Todd Haskell are unable to join us, but we're very lucky to have Sir Robert Fry and Simon Haselock with us here today. And they bring, between the two of them, they bring, many years of experience working actually in the area and in the field, and are kind of leaders, I would say, in thinking about the problems of communication and the relationship with policy in areas of concern like the Horn of Africa and the Western Sahel. So I'm just going to briefly read their bios, although it's in the program if you haven't got a copy. So Sir Robert Fry is the chairman of Albany Associates and the former deputy commanding general of coalition forces in Iraq of the Royal Marines. He is involved in a number of boards and advisory roles to companies in the security and banking sectors throughout Europe, North America, and the Middle East. Currently, he is a visiting professor at Reading University and a visiting fellow at Oxford. Simon Haselock, to my left, is co-founder and chief operating officer of Albany Associates. From 1995 to 96, he served as the NATO spokesman in Sarajevo and later as media commissioner in Kosovo. He went on to become the director of public information for the United Nations mission in Kosovo and led the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for Media Development in Iraq. So the schedule for today is, first we'll be hearing from Sir Robert Fry and then from Simon Haselock. I will pose to them a couple questions based on the comments they make. I have read the work on soft power from Joseph Nye on, and so I'm interested in thinking about the problems of actual application of the theoretical concept. So maybe my questions will be geared towards that direction, and then also just specific questions about what's happening in the Horn of Africa and the Western Sahel. So I anticipate maybe, getting 2 or 3 questions in before we opening it up to the audience at the end. And lastly, I wanted to let you know that if you are a Twitter user, it's okay if you're on your cell phone during the talk, as long as you are tweeting about this event. And the hashtag that we can, use to discuss the event is hashtag SoftPowerGW. Hashtag SoftPowerGW. So. For now, I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, Sir Robert Fry.
Thank you very much indeed, most kind. We had intended to do this yesterday, and I can't tell you how gratifying it is to come to somebody else's capital and find it just as difficult as we do to negotiate the weather. As has already been said, I'm the chairman of Albany Associates. Albany Associates is a small British company based in London, and it really is about trying to communicate in difficult environments. Simon founded the company after a career in the military and has been involved professionally in the game of communications from the Balkans, through Iraq, through Afghanistan, into Somalia, and I guess has had in British terms, certainly one of the most unbroken careers in this game that anybody has had. We both happen to be ex-Marines. You don't have to be a Marine to work in Albany, but it sort of helps. And I guess it gives us some sense of common background. Now, this is about soft power. It's about it's about Africa, and it's about today. So what I want to start talking about is hard power in 1914 in Europe. Just indulge me. And if this comes off, then you will see that there is a sort of circular process going on. And what I should do is serve the ball up to Simon to then begin to speak more precisely about the issue that is advertised. I think I make the judgment, and this is not a revelation of mine. Others have as well. Perhaps primarily Eric Hobsbawm, Cambridge academic, that the 20th century was a truncated process. Starting in 1914 and ending in 1989. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the thesis that what started with an act of German aggression in 1914 and ended with an act of Soviet exhaustion in 1989 is a single historical narrative containing the 30 Years' War of the 20th century, the twin abominations of Nazism and Soviet communism. But whatever else it is, it constitutes a single consolidated, coherent block of historical narrative, fundamentally about Europe, fundamentally about very traditional approaches to strategy, and primarily, particularly for the Anglo-Saxon nations, about preserving and defending liberal democracy in our own countries. Then, at the end of that spell, we have entered into a period of what I can best describe as strategic aberration, I think. And we may be about to come out of that. And it's been strategically aberrant in a couple of senses. The first thing is that rather than defending liberal freedoms in our own countries, we have actually tried to propagate liberal freedoms in other people's countries. That's what the interventions in, first of all, way back in 1991, the first Gulf War, then through the Balkans, latterly for the British in Sierra Leone and in a few other places, and then for both of our countries from 2001 onwards in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Aberrant in that sense, aberrant also in the sense that the large sweeps of international politics have not been at the forefront of strategic thought. I mean, whatever the 20th century was about, it was about great powers. I begin to get a sense that what comes after the period of strategic aberration that we're currently in is going to be another period of things which actually are dominated by great powers. We already see magazine coverage about the new Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We now see the US State Department making a really dramatic intervention in the Middle East to draw Iran in, with seismic implications for the whole of the Middle East. So we've come from a period which looks historically and strategically solid. We're looking forward to a period which might have many of the characteristics of the 20th century, but we've just been through a period which is aberrant in terms of what has come before and may give no indications about what is to come in the future. I was a professional soldier for a long time. I spent a lot of time with the US forces. And I would say that one of the things that I've always admired about the American Armed Forces is their ability to innovate. Now, in part, this is just the national vocation for reinvention, which I think is probably the defining characteristic of this country. And every American army that's gone to a big war, what went to war at the beginning bore no resemblance to what left at the end. So the Union forces in 1861 did not look anything like the forces that went through the South and then forced Vicksburg and so on. The expeditionary force was only there for a relatively short time, but between April 1917 and November 1918, unrecognizable at the end from the beginning, and then huge changes made during the Second World War. And you've continued that process now. And I think that you're about to embark on the fifth army, and when I say army, I mean all of the armed forces, the fifth army of the 20th century. The first army that you had was the one conceived by Colin Powell and Weinberger, which was all about overwhelming force, very clearly defined objectives and routes to the exit. And that was a doctrinal backdrop that you brought into 9/11. What then immediately happened is that Donald Rumsfeld completely inverted the entire process, went for very light touch forces, primarily special forces, large numbers, huge volumes of indirect fire, bombs from airplanes, missiles from ships, and large numbers of spooks, your spooks and our spooks, running around with suitcases of money. There was a compliant local infantry, which was the Northern Alliance, and a compliant, at least then compliant, politician in the shape of Hamid Karzai. And in no time flat, we sort of thought that we had solved the problem. That Rumsfeld doctrine then became the new orthodoxy, and that same military instrument was then deployed in Iraq. Iraq was a completely different situation from Afghanistan. Afghanistan has always been a very strong society and a very weak state. Iraq, by contrast, always a strong state and a very weak society. So we were trying to use a force in almost polarically different circumstances. And then from 2003 to maybe 2006, we released forces that we could neither comprehend nor control. And that was an extremely difficult period for the American military, for the British military, and all others who were involved at the time. But at the end of that, that process created the genesis for the third army of this century, which was the counterinsurgency army, primarily associated with names like Petraeus, perhaps unfairly, because I think an awful lot of Americans made very, very significant contributions to that. This was a huge achievement for your military to get through, because you've always abhorred counterinsurgency, and the whole idea of building nations is just anathema to a military which has usually fought its wars by industrial process rather than anything more subtle. Your achievement was to do it extraordinarily well. And I think by 2006, 2007, you really understood, probably better than anybody else operating in Iraq, and certainly better than the British, who had previously, hitherto, thought themselves the master of the discipline. But it didn't last forever, and counterinsurgency is a very, very expensive business. It's expensive in money, it's expensive in people, but most of all, it's expensive in time. And you are a strategically impatient polity. And the whole idea of running that on endlessly is something that you did not find attractive. Neither did the Brits. And I can give you the reasons for that, but I won't do that, or the reasons that I think for that. I won't do that now. Then I guess from 2008, 2009 onward, we had the beginnings of a counter-terrorist campaign. Counter-terrorist, quite different from counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency is large numbers of people trying to create the edifice of a state on the streets of the environment in which they are operating. Counter-terrorism, quite different. It's about killing the bad guys. And you have done that systematically since, by the use of drones, by the use of special forces raids, and so on. And I guess the sort of high point of that was the killing of Osama bin Laden, but in many ways that was merely the illustration of a trend rather than representing a trend in itself. And now you find yourself coming out of the end of this process with an entirely new set of strategic priorities facing you globally. This long advertised pivot to the Pacific, well, you know, we'll all be glad when it happens, but I don't think it's going to be happening anytime soon. But what you're going to have is a military and statecraft as well. You're going to have a national strategy which will involve all of the instruments of national power, which needs to look for a relationship of conventional deterrence with China and other players within the Pacific region. At the same time, you are going to have to continue to be major players in the Middle East, where the civil war within Islam, which has been rumbling now for some time, is going to run on for a long time to come. If history is any guide, religious wars tend to run for decades rather than for years. So the Middle East is likely to be an unreconciled environment for a long time to come. Oil is the least of your worries in the Middle East, but I think nuclear weapons is probably the main worry. It's a main worry for everybody, not only the United States. So I see no disengagement occurring there. And on top of that, you have this residual awkward thing called international terrorism. And I think that the global war on terrorism is now both an idea and a campaign which has outlived its time and become redundant. But you cannot entirely ignore it. It is precisely by ignoring these large white areas on the map that things happened in Afghanistan that came back to haunt you. Precisely the same things can happen in the trackless wastes of the Sahara, the Sahel, and the Horn of Africa. So it seems to me that you are confronting a range of strategic challenges just coming out of a period of strategic aberration, and you need to think really seriously about how you're going to address all these things into the future. And I would throw one more consideration into the pot, one more ingredient in the factors that you have to consider, and that's the strategic deficit that the West faces at the present time. Any day of the week, you can find an op-ed in in the Washington Post, New York Times on the fiscal deficit. You certainly can in the Times or the Telegraph in London. Preoccupies every piece of political debate. What is a fiscal deficit? It is the difference between what you raise in taxes and what you spend. It's pretty simple stuff. No rocket science involved in this. So what do? You raise more tax or you spend less. Those are the adjustments you have to make. But there is an exact corollary to this in terms of strategic power, certainly in my country, and I think increasingly in your country, which and that is that the scale of ambition that you have is no longer met by the capacity for hard power. It's exactly like taxes and spending. And if you spend too much and you don't raise enough taxes, then you have a deficit problem. And you have a strategic deficit problem in exactly the same way that we do. So bring all that I've said and bring it now to today, counterterrorism in the Sahel, the Sahara, and the Horn of Africa. You cannot avoid paying some attention to these places. Neither, however, do you have the hard power facilities, the hard power capacity, nor the hard power appetite to engage in these places in the way in which you traditionally might. And there's a number of ways you can make up the deficit. You can either reduce the scale of ambition, which I think is unacceptable to America. I think that there is an inalienable level of strategic ambition that you must have. You might ask your allies to do more, and you will ask your allies to do more, but they're in the same situation that you are. And so there's no magic solutions there. Or you can begin to look at non-traditional mixes between hard and soft power in order to bring about strategic effect. So the whole point of what I'm trying to say to you is that I think we can see where we have been strategically. I'm talking about the West as a whole, but very specifically about America. We can see where we're about to be as we emerge from a period of an odd strategic period, but certainly an aberrant one, and we're about to enter into another. One for which collectively we are unprepared in terms of the facilities and the instruments of statecraft to discharge the responsibilities that we have. Terrorism will not go away. You will continue to pay serious attention to it, because if you don't, the same thing will happen in the future that happened 12 years ago, and you will rue the fact that you didn't pay it attention. So you will need to look at counterterrorism. You will need to look at places which at a glance have no strategic impact upon American vital interests, but they do at one remove. And you're going to need to think about the mix between hard power and soft power that you put to that. And one of the very few areas of potential solution in the conundrum that I presented to you is a much more assiduous but also astute use of soft power in pursuit of national grand strategies.
Mr. Simon Haselock?
Thank you. I think it's in many ways it's a shame that we've gone from the great strategic breadth of what Rob is saying to I'm sort of now going to talk quite tactically, and we're missing the State Department people who would have been in the middle, who would have been to speak more about U.S. policy in this area. I mean, I want to make 3 points essentially. I mean, the first is the significance of otherwise of what we call Western soft power in terms of how it's applied to the region that we're talking about, and of course, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Sahel are intimately connected in ways which we all know and which I'll refer to in a minute. The second point is, notwithstanding Western soft power, what do we mean by the regional soft power? I mean, what soft power assets are there available in the region which are perhaps more appropriate to dealing with the problems that they confront? And thirdly, I just want to sort of give some lessons from our own particular experience, specifically in Somalia and the Horn of Africa, where Albany has been running a project for 5 years now, funded by the UN, working alongside the African Union in Mogadishu and Somalia. And perhaps also a reference to some of the stuff in Mali that we've also been involved in as well, and the connection that runs in the way radicalization is taking place from the Horn of Africa through the Sahel into the Western Sahel and Nigeria and beyond. So, sort of slightly controversially, although I think it picks up on what, maybe not controversially, but it picks up a bit on what Rob is saying about the business about Western soft power. I mean, the problem is that you referred to Nye, and Nye talks about, the 3 sources of soft power being, culture, your culture. But of course, it's only effective if the places that you're trying to take your culture to find it attractive, that they like it, they accept it, it's appropriate. Secondly, the country's political values, and of course, those values are only appropriate in soft power terms if they're lived up to, or people accept them as being lived up to both at home and abroad. So, your political values have to be not just stated, but they have to be practiced or seen to be practiced. And foreign policy. And obviously where that foreign policy has more authority as perceived by the people on the receiving end of it. So that's, all seems to make sense. The problem is that in the West, we probably have a problem with that now, is that we, before the UK and the US, and the US in particular, took for granted, I think, that they were seen as a benign force in the world and an aspirational model to take. And I think that, over the last 10 or so years, maybe more, that sort of assumption has been challenged. And that, to a certain extent, is the context against which our sort of conventional soft power public diplomacy backdrop is seen against, is that the things that we perhaps used to think of as a given that people aspire to aren't necessarily the case, and that the political changes and the religious and sectarian changes that have, or tensions that have manifested themselves in the region are things that challenge that, but the things that we take for granted aren't necessarily the case. And I look at UK, for example, and Rob and I were talking about the other day, there was a demonstration that was on television with some radical Islamists in a mosque in London demonstrating against democracy. They actually had signs saying, democracy is bad, we need an Islamic state, Allah, etc. So this challenges our, it's a sort of, what are they talking about? It's a sort of a difficult concept to understand. They're demonstrating against democracy, where demonstrations certainly in my lifetime, have always been in favor of democracy. So it's a sort of an interesting challenge. So some of these basic things that we consider, I think, and in the end, so the next point I want to make about regional soft power is that in the context of trying to deal with these problems in the region, it means that we need to understand these places better, that we need to understand the context. And I think that one of the problems that I've perceived as we go into places and we approach places without a sufficient depth of understanding of the cultural, moral, traditional, religious local traditions of the regions. And I think we all have, we've come to accept that now, but the trouble is we've tripped over them into greater levels in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's very difficult to overcome that. So in looking at the Sahel and North Africa, where the problem is now migrating, that's something that I think needs more attention paid to it. And of course, inside the region, and so-called Arab Spring started in the North Africa and Tunisia, there is this competition between democracy and radical Islam, which is represented in this demonstration that I described. Those who started the revolution who are looking for a democratic solution to dictatorships, but that has been hijacked by this, in a lot of areas, you see it in Syria and other places, by this radical Islamic agenda. And what are the lessons that have been learned by the radicals from some of the things that have occurred? Egypt, what does that, for instance, say to radical Islam? Do we indulge in the democratic process, or is that not for us because we've just been overthrown? Therefore, maybe violence is our only. So what are the lessons of that? The second thing, of course, in terms of regional soft power is what I referred to as the changing of centre of gravity for the AQ-related affiliates and sort of franchise. The franchise has moved from sort of Pakistan, Afghan border, and it's moving through the Yemen into the Horn of Africa. And AlShabaab, in many ways, has adopted the sort of the cause belli as the preeminent name in the world of an active, aggressive, and the Westgate attacks, a few months ago was a classic example of that. So you have now the sort of center of gravity from Al-Qaeda moving into North Africa and the Sahel. Very similar set of circumstances to what they found in Afghanistan. Broad empty spaces, no boundaries to speak of, chaos, and a lot of sort of failed states. And that certainly was the case in Somalia when they started getting into Somalia. And they offer, in these societies, and this was certainly the case in Somalia, quite an attractive narrative, because Somalia was in chaos. It was in chaos and was to a certain extent it still is, but less so than it was. But for 20 years, Somalia was a complete failed state. And everybody, as you know, thought of Somalia as the most failed of failed states. So the narrative that everybody had in the West, if you asked somebody in the street, was, Black Hawk Down. I mean, it was their sort of understanding of Somalia was the Black Hawk Down book and the film, etc. And, a completely and utterly irretrievable place with a sort of Mission Impossible brand placed upon it, that very complicated, nothing that we can do about it. We know it's important, but don't get involved in it because it's going to suck you and suck you dry. And of course, what AlShabaab do through the original, for the Islamic Courts Union, which was their predecessor, basically established some form of order out of the chaos of the warlordism and the corruption and the infighting and the clan squabbling that had been going on, and they produced some form of order. And it might, we'll come on to it, might have been a sort of an alien religious practice, but at the time, order was what was wanted: security, order, some form of rough justice, something that actually made life, people able to go about their normal daily life. What then happened, of course, is that we in the West saw the ICU as a sort of agent of Al-Qaeda and the war on terror, and we didn't like the idea that there was an Islamic-run resurgence in Somalia. So through the aegis of Ethiopia as a surrogate, the ICU was overthrown. Ethiopia, being the sort of traditional Christian enemy of Somalia, enabled AlShabaab as a militia within the ICU to become the preeminent military force fighting the Ethiopians. When the Ethiopians withdrew, who was left standing? AlShabaab as a strong, and they, of course, had kicked out the Ethiopians, and they became the strongest show in town, and they had created some form of stability, and so they controlled everything. And you see the trajectory I'm going on is that, it's us understanding, what values and cultural things matter. So they provided a source of security, relative stability, etc. And it was also seen in the context of the previous failed Western interventions in Somalia. I mean, there were 2 UN missions, and one obviously famously the American-led one, which ostensibly failed and left behind, a chaotic situation similar to the one that they stand. So AlShabaab and that whole ethos was seen against the fact that the West had failed the people of Somalia from their point of view, not from the AlShabaab themselves, but the people who were perhaps wishing for something else. So, the Western idea was not necessarily that favourable because they'd sort of left them and gone away. And so AlShabaab is not it's a symptom rather than a cause in Somalia. And if you look at some of the dynamics in other parts of the region, whilst they're not necessarily as failed as chaotic as perhaps Somalia was and is, those ingredients are there, and through the Arab Spring or through the various, places like Niger, certainly in Mali, northern Mali, these areas are ungoverned spaces where people have grievances, they don't trust the central government, this is the sort of area where these organizations gain purchase. And there are similarities, I say, in Mali and in northern Nigeria, regardless of the fact that Nigeria is such a strong and about to emerge as the strongest economy in Africa. The north of Nigeria is not a well-governed space. But against all this, of course, is you have a cultural tradition in North Africa which is not Wahhabi or Salafi. It is Sufi, and it's a much more moderate form of Islam. And so, therefore, you have an organization which is initially appealing, but finds itself at odds with the traditional cultural and religious practice of the region. And thereby is the vulnerability that they suffer and have been able to exploit. And if you look at Somalia, and I'll talk in specific about sort of what has happened in Somalia and particularly the use of soft power and communications, is that as AlShabaab gained in strength and authority inside Somalia, some realities began to dawn on Somalis, and that was, the reign of terror that they imposed, and a very, very strict, hard interpretation of Sharia. Some terrible stories of Islamic punishments, cross amputations. You'll have seen I'm sure some of you who look at Somalia have heard the story about the 2 young boys who were cross amputated for theft, And then the imam came and looked at them and said, "You haven't done that correctly. You haven't taken enough off." So they were taken back out and had another inch shaved off each limb to make sure it was correctly done. This is the sort of practice which was, being seen as the reign of terror, and all sorts of other examples of that. And the second thing is patently the foreign religious practice. They started smashing Sufi shrines, throwing the bones in the sea, doing things which were countercultural, including in the military operations. On the 3rd of December 2009, they blew up a hotel in Mogadishu where there was a graduation ceremony for doctors. So all these medical students about to become doctors, to help the community, were blown up by a man with a suicide vest wearing a burqa. And this, culturally, this was considered to be an extremely, un-Somali practice. Foreign leadership, it became clearer and clearer that AlShabaab was not Somali indigenous, and their great cry that they were an indigenous insurgency against foreign intervention became and has become a myth. And their leadership is not Somali. They have affiliated with AQ, and Al-Qaeda made a big thing about that. And a lot of their leadership and the regions are people from outside Somalia, particularly Yemenis, some from Kenya, and also internationals, Somalis, Americans and Brits of Somali origin, but not Somalis. I mean, there's Al-Ameriki is a famous character who recently was killed by Gadani. And then on top of that, you have all this countercultural stuff, which is related to the sort of religious practice. But all the things that football, for example, during the last World Cup, people weren't allowed to watch or listen to the football matches. They're not allowed to sing and dance. They're not allowed to, have music on their mobile phones. All these sorts of austere interpretations of, conservative Islam, is against what is essentially a Sufi, much more sort of, completely different culture and practice. And this has made them very unpopular. And then on top of that, when in 2010, 2011, during the Ramadan offensive, Al-Shabaab actually were militarily confronted and defeated in Mogadishu, the myth of invincibility goes, and that enables the dissatisfaction side to sort of really start to get voiced. When you're in the ascendant, people are quieter, but when you start to rock back, the voice begins to come out. And so you saw, as the military, they began to get squeezed militarily, you saw the local voice against Al-Shabaab as a foreign intervention in its own right, coming out from locals. And if you like, the most extraordinary example of that is the fact that the Ethiopians came back and are now part of AMISOM, and they are not universally hated. There is a sort of, in the area which they operate in, one, they've learnt a lot of lessons from their previous experience, and they allow the normal commercial activity of farming in those areas to go on unhindered. But secondly, people say, better the Ethiopians in the short term than Al-Shabaab. We don't want them here for long, but we'd rather have them than Al-Shabaab. So it's an incredible turnaround in many ways. And to some extent, it's a similar experience in Mali. In Mali, the religious, although it was very short-lived, but it was short-lived because this trajectory I've described was concertinaed much more quickly. People became very quickly aware that these people coming down from Algeria, etc., were not indigenous. It was foreign practice. They started smashing, the Sufi sites, and very quickly people, became, and even the people who they were aligned with, the Tuareg, who had been aligned for sort of reasons of, convenience, realized that actually, this was not a good alliance to have. So very quickly, the religious-based Salafi Wahhabi insurgency in Mali very quickly became, unpopular, and it's a similar. So I think there's something to be taken from that. But the point that I'm trying to make, this second point, is the fact that the most effective soft power counter is their own culture, politics, and policy, if you like, foreign policy, not so much ours. We have objectives, but the soft power to deal with the circumstances on the ground are things that are resonant of life and belief and tradition on the ground, not the turning of their life belief into something that is an external understanding. No, we're not bringing Western democracy to Somalia. We're not bringing Western democracy to Mali. We're enabling their societies to mend themselves based upon their own traditional practice and culture. Which brings me on to the third and final point, which is, the specific lessons of this from our experience in Somalia. And I think the first interesting thing is the whole question of the African solutions for African problems story of the AU intervention. As an ex-soldier, I can watch and have been in Mogadishu from 2009, seeing the African Union engage with Al-Shabaab in what was certainly the most intense military conflict that I've ever seen, in terms of a largely untold story of Second World War street-to-street type fighting without all the sort of modern sophistication of aerial surveillance, and they didn't know what was happening 2 streets beyond them largely. So they were going street to street, building to building, very, very intense. One afternoon, a Burundian brigade attacked part of Mogadishu in the assault through Mogadishu. 77 soldiers were killed in a couple of hours, and 280 were wounded. Now, can you imagine a Western force in an operation like Afghanistan or Iraq or any UN intervention? Can you imagine the international coalition that put them there surviving that sort of casualty? But the next morning, the Burundians got up and went again. So it's a very, very different understanding of the nature of what needs to be done in these circumstances. The other thing which is interesting about the AU is that, despite the whole narrative of foreign intervention, they have been able to create a narrative which is, this is about Africa helping itself. There's a tradition in Africa, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you go and put your neighbor's house out. You will lend a hand. And back in the days of some of the colonial struggles, when Somalia was a strong Soviet-aligned country, it had a very, very powerful army, and it was very, very professional. And in those days, it helped and supported many of the struggles, the insurgencies against colonial powers in other parts of Africa. So this is seen as them coming back to help the people that helped them. So 2 things: you help your neighbor, and we owe you a debt because you helped us in our struggles for freedom ourselves. And it's quite a powerful notion. And if you can prevent and help them get over some of the obvious contradictions that there are in that narrative, then it makes it even stronger. And clearly, the African Union had been able to manage an intensity of operations which no Western force or no UN force could manage in Mogadishu, which has enabled them to clear Al-Shabaab from Mogadishu itself, which then enabled there to be the political space for a political transition to take place, which was seen as more legitimate than the previous political construct that was there before, and a bit of that in a minute. So you have a different narrative now. I talked about Mission Impossible, which is, from a global soft power perspective, if you have a narrative that has Mission Impossible, countries who are required to assist them, and the African Union is backed by the Americans and the European Union and the UK. I mean, I say the European Union and UK because there's European Union money and there's specifically UK resources. But the African Union is African troops on the ground, but it is resourced and supported by Western finance and money and equipment. In order to sustain that, there needs to be a notion in the West that actually this is worthwhile, that there is, if you're going to go to the next level, because clearly the issue in Somalia is that they need a larger force now to control the larger area of territory which they now have. And we can perhaps talk about that in questions. You need to make sure that governments who are investing in this see that there is some return for their investment. So this narrative of Mission Impossible is not a good one if you need to attract people to invest in success. Now I think we have a narrative of Mission Possible. It's not right. There's still a long way to go. Al-Shabaab is on the back foot, but it's not dead. But it is Mission Impossible. So that narrative enables governments to become engaged. So, this is sort of at the global level. What was the strategy in Somalia from a communications perspective, soft power perspective? Well, it's not. I mean, it's the familiar X chart that everybody understands. It's simple in itself. Is that you need to reinforce the institutions and the coalition, what we call the coalition for peace, help the government communicate, help it, but not just communicate, but help it embed and improve its legitimacy, because legitimacy is a crucial currency of politics in that space, and also help the profile and acceptability of the security forces that are there, so that you see this nexus. And at the same time, the other part of the X chart, the declining part, is obviously undercutting the effectiveness of what we would term the obstructionists, which are many and varied, from pirates to warlords, but predominantly over the last few years, obviously, it's been AlShabaab. So how do you attack and undermine AlShabaab? And one of the crucial things in this is this connection between policy and action, and need to make sure that when we talk, our concept of communications is not defined, as it so often is, by these firewalls and structures and disciplines, and we don't believe in the Praetorian Guard of communicators going out, having taken policy and then you go and communicate it. We see this as an integrated process which is completely connected, and politics is about communications and persuasion. And so it's something that has to be, policy. If it's bad policy and you have, or it's going to be unpopular policy, but needs to be done. It requires a different communications approach than just assuming it's going to be right and good for you. So it's a question of making sure you understand that. And a particular example at a tactical level, if you like, in Somalia of this is was the whole question of use of indirect fire weapons, which is something that happens a lot in these sort of circumstances. Civilian casualties caused by the indiscriminate use of indirect fire. And of course, we see this in Pakistan and all sorts of other places. What do you do about that? And the African Union there was a huge perception within the African Union in the early days that they were indiscriminately shelling Mogadishu, particularly Bakara Market, and killing civilians. And AlShabaab were making hay with that narrative, in terms of there was a chap called Ali Musa, who was supposedly the head of the Mogadishu ambulance service. I mean, he's a sort of completely fictitious personality who was always quoted as saying so many casualties were taken to the hospital from a bomb that exploded. The problem was, though, that although African Union patently were not using indiscriminate indirect fire, nobody knew that, and nor could they prove, the African Union, that they weren't, because they had no proper policy and system in place to be able to account for fire missions and all the rest of it. So from a communications perspective, we looked at this and realized you can't, if we're going to communicate this, you're going to have to improve your ability to demonstrate that you're not doing it. And so we carried out a policy action. I brought in an ex-military colleague of mine who had been a commander in Afghanistan, who wrote a policy for the AMISOM in the use of indirect fire. And we paired them up with an organization called the Campaign for Innocent Victims of Violence, which is an American NGO, who had a lot of experience, who looked at the compensation and attribution end of it, and how you developed a process which not only linked the fact that you could account for ammunition fired, where those targets were fired, that you knew what had happened, but also that there was a system in place to alleviate any collateral damage that might have taken place at the other end, or to at least be seen to investigate it through a legitimate organization which was not seen as part of the military establishment. And then you have something to publicize, military system with an NGO whose focus was not on the military objective, but on alleviating civilian suffering. And you have a policy which works and can be sold and deals with the issue that it was confronting. And that revolutionized the way that the African Union were perceived in terms of its use of those sorts of weapons. The next point I want to make, I'll stop in a minute, is the other thing that I think is important, going back to this narrative idea and this idea about local soft power being the key, is that we get quite fed up with this discussion about messaging. This whole idea that communications is about sending messages, and I understand the talk about sort of creating messages, but we see that it's about telling stories. Narratives are made up of stories, and the way to establish the sort of dialogues and conversations you need in these areas is to tell stories, and you telling the stories of the things which support the narrative that you want. So rather than firing messages down the range, which are rather sort of almost patronizing sort of lecturing. You want a conversation, and you want to develop a narrative trajectory which is based upon telling the stories which make up and contribute to that narrative. So it's a much more sort of, if you like, almost a journalistic approach to it, rather than necessarily a sort of this messaging stuff. The second thing is encouraging platforms, and it's interesting that even in a place like Somalia, I mean, the amount of mobile phone uptake in Africa is incredible. When you look at the sort of uptake statistics, you'll see Somalia's not on it at all, because the mobile phone networks in Somalia are all unregulated, unofficial, privately owned, and they're not counted. But there are 3 of them. They're the richest companies in Somalia, and you can get 3G and soon to have 4G phones in Somalia. Very, very effective. AlShabaab, as you know, has been extremely effective in its use of online media, particularly in radicalizing people in the diaspora to come in. And they're also very conscious of its effect against them, because they recently banned the use of internet by people in the areas which they control. So it's an interesting juxtaposition between their sort of use of it as a weapon, particularly Twitter, and there's a lot been written about their Twitter campaign during the Westgate, etc., and their concern about its effect on them. So therefore, you need to make sure that people don't use it in the areas that you control. Obviously, I've mentioned the crucial importance of local voices. But the final thing I just want to say, which brings us back to the whole Sahel and the regional question, is the fact that AlShabaab is a changed creature as a consequence of what's happened in Somalia. A lot of the stuff you read about talks about AlShabaab as a resurgent organization, post-Westgate and all the rest of it. But interestingly, what has happened is they have changed from what was essentially an organization designed to create an Islamic emirate within Somalia, now knowing they can't do that. They don't control the territory. They're on the back foot. They've lost their financial backing. Their economic levers have been squeezed. The African Union and the government are now in control. The government itself is much more legitimate. And I can talk about what was done to help make that legitimacy transparent during questions, if you like. So you've had this split between the two of the premier people within AlShabaab. One is a character known as Dr. Robbo. The other one is known as Gadane. Robbo was the one who, after the 3rd of December bomb in the hotel, said, "We can't do this because we're losing the support of the people." Gadane said, "We're not here to support the people, we're here to serve God," which basically demonstrates the difference between the idea of a local insurgency and a global jihad. And Gadane is the one who's knocked off a lot of the regional leaders in terms of assassinations. He has also the one who now talks about the affiliation with Al-Qaeda. He's the one who is behind Westgate. And Al-Shabaab is now not so much a force inside Somalia looking to set up an Islamic state, if you like, in Somalia. It's much more the genesis of a African AQ affiliate, which basically wants to transport from East Africa across the region of Sahel. And there are links between Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentations, both the kind of overarching view of doctrinal changes in the military and this longer historical view that I think you make a good case for the necessity of new approaches to the exercise of power. And then, thank you for the specific examples in discussing soft power in the region of focus and looking at particular projects. I'm wondering to what extent do you see, or I guess, how would you explain the sort of obstacles to these sorts of approaches, or what do you in your work come across within U.S. and U.K. foreign policy establishments? What is preventing the adoption of approaches that allow more breathing room for regional soft power, or for practices that are policy to sort of follow cultural understanding and better knowledge about the places of focus. So what are these obstacles that need to be overcome to move to this next phase? So this question is for both of you.
Maybe I'll kick off. If it's a sort of list of complaints against the British Foreign Office, you just don't have enough time. But I guess that's the way that that lots of, particularly military, feel about the conjunction with diplomacy. I tell you, one of the things that really gets in the way of conveying a simple, clear and definitive message, and that is we tend to be too clever by half. Simon was talking about the simplicity and the clarity that was given to Somalia for a brief period. Exactly the same thing in Afghanistan. Whatever the Taliban does or does not do, it confers a very simple and easily understood rule of law. You tend to get taxed once rather than every time you go through a roadblock with corrupt policemen on there. And if you have a dispute, you can go to a process of Taliban arbitration, which is simple, direct, and sometimes very absolute, but it's there. And there is a clarity and simplicity about that, which I think that the societies which operate particularly in the Pashtun parts of Afghanistan, entirely understand. During the lead-up to the Second Gulf War, the British military, the American military were doing exactly the same, were bombarding the Iraqis, the Iraqi populace, but also the Iraqi regime with all sorts of messages. And we were doing this in all sorts of different ways. We were texting them, sending them messages through their computers and dropping leaflets out of the sky. We knew exactly the messages that we were communicating, and we made the profound mistake of thinking that those same messages were being understood in precisely the same way on the other side. But of course, we had no reference points. We didn't know the way that these things were being received because we were not rooted in the culture that we were trying to actually influence. So I think one of the key mistakes that we have made in the past and are in danger of making in the future is using the standards of Madison Avenue communication as the gold standard for working in developing environments with very, very clear cultural mores, which the practices of Madison Avenue either completely bypass or alienate. So I think one of the first things that I would say is that simple, direct, and clear.
I'll take a slightly different approach. I think what are the things that are obstacles? I mean, I'd say the contradiction within government between the political cycle, the time of political cycle, and the time that it takes to affect these sorts of changes on the ground. And the second thing, which is related to that, I think, is the question of crisis management. I think that the trouble is that you have two levels within, certainly in my experience of this in the UK government, is, crisis drives its own momentum. And it's very difficult for people who are sat in a desk covering an area to sit back and refer to the sort of the wisdom of experience in other people when there is a crisis being driven by events and time on the ground. And so it's a question of how do you reconcile the management of the emerging foreign policy crisis with the lessons and understanding of the environment in which you operate, and it might seem obvious, but these things do not connect. There is a sort of a bunch of people in the bowels of the Foreign Office who understand parts of the world. You want to find anything about South Sudan or Kordofan or something. There's a bloke in the bowels of the Foreign Office who can tell you almost every baby born by their first name. But if there is a problem in South Kordofan, he probably doesn't get spoken to till fairly far down. Policy's been made, decisions, and all of a sudden, oh shit, we've got that bloke down there who knows all about it. Why didn't we talk to him before? So making these connections, I think, is important. And I think the problem is that we do a lot of training in Albany with communicators, and the problem is that we don't need to train communicators. We need to train leaders and the people who are responsible for communications, because I think there is also a misunderstanding, and it's a generational thing, and it's this whole business about digital natives and digital immigrants, I suppose. But there is still this basic thing that people think that communications is about the media, and it's a press and media operation in terms of a lot of, certainly, I mean, I might be being unfair, I can't speak for the State Department, but I can certainly, I know when I speak to ambassadors, they think, I mean, I'll be frank with you, don't tweet this, but we are currently working for the Foreign Office, helping the Syrian National Coalition in Geneva. And there's this obsession with it all being about, what the headlines say, not about how you communicate with Syrians. How do you connect the Syrian National Coalition with their constituency on the ground to give them political legitimacy that enables them to be able to negotiate with Assad? It's not about what the New York Times says about the negotiations. It's not about what Louis Safi says at the press conference. It's about their political legitimacy within Syria. And that's a very different approach to than running a press campaign to manage their ability to present themselves in front of the world media, which is what we're doing. But if you see the point I'm making, so there needs to be, I think, a better understanding of what communications is about, and getting away from this notion that it is a black art, carried out by, as I keep using this term, this Praetorian Guard of strategic communicators who appear when you've got a problem or appear when you have a policy to sell. It must be much more integrated.
Just to follow up on that, if you could, would you go to the mic? Just had ACL surgery, so it's a bit of a challenge. Turn it on. Sorry. Turn it on. All right.
I heard you.
All right, here we go. Thank God I sing and know where to put the button. Back to when you were speaking before, Simon, about how legitimacy of the government was sort of engendered in Somalia. You said you might come back to that during the Q&A, so I thought I would just kind of carry on from what you were just speaking about and ask if you take a moment and speak about that.
Yes. The problem in Somalia with the transitional federal government, I don't know are people familiar with what I'm talking about, the TFG? The transitional federal government was one of these international constructions, and 500 members of parliament, more for 4 million people, more than Indian parliament has for how many? Almost billion, I suspect. I don't know what the population of India is now. So I mean, this huge sort of all working off European Union international stipends. None of them living in Somalia, controlled by a speaker who was a known warlord, profiteer, and spoiler of the process. And a problem of legitimacy. One of the reasons why AlShabaab were affected in this government was clearly patently unrepresentative, clearly corrupt, clearly connected with a lot of the warlord activities that had been going on before, was essentially there to preserve its own ability to manage the gangster economy, essentially, not in place to actually establish the rule of law, etc., within Somalia. So much so that the whole transitional idea, the transition period was basically extended because they wouldn't actually carry out what they were mandated to do, which was to focus on the transition until a series of things happened. But then when it actually, whatever the catalyst was, when it became clear that the transition was going to take place, what was going to be the shape and form of the next government? And so, there was going to be how are you going to, you weren't going to be, the place was not ready for free and fair elections. So there needed to be another form of interim government as opposed to transitional government, something that was a midway point between the TFG and a properly elected government. And so what needed to be done to make that sort of interim stage as legitimate as possibly could? So the recognition was it needs to be done through the traditional system by using, rather like an Afghan lawyer jirga. I think in Somalia they call it a gurta, which is when you bring together the representatives of the clans, the elders, and they sit around and they will agree. So the idea was to get the elders together to actually do two things. One was to look at the interim constitution and agree it, and secondly was to elect who was going to be elected into the what was going to be the new Houses of Parliament with a reduced number of MPs. Now, the trouble with that is, of course, that the corrupt system within Somalia, nobody could. So you have, whose elders are these? How do you know that these are really the traditional elders? Because Sheikh Sharif and Sheikh Hassan, the then president, and the warlord. It's really sort of. I mean, they were known to try to gerrymander the way that these, so, they will choose their elders, if you see what I mean, rather than the real traditional elders. So there needed to be a system put in place that was transparent, which demonstrated that these people were really the elders, and everybody could see that they were the elders. And there also needed to be a thing that made sure that the interim constitution was as transparent as it was, because there'd been a lot of sort of attacking the constitution of being un-Islamic and this and that and the other, because nobody really nobody could say it wasn't. So the rumor mill was, so, we had to make sure that the selection of the elders was transparent, that the voting on the constitution was transparent, that the voting that established the parliamentary seats was transparent, and that finally the election of the president and the final analysis by the MPs was also seen as transparent. And there was an awful lot of communications effort put into that to make sure that all these processes were live streamed, that there were sets of criteria laid out and publicised as to how people could be knocked off the list for being elders or being future MPs. And that process, we ran it. We partnered with a local website, a local Mogadishu-based website, and we live streamed most of these things. And the servers collapsed because they were so, people were clicking on to watch this so much. And the proof in the pudding, and the proof of the pie is in the eating in many ways, is in the end, the person who was elected was, the fact that he may have ended up, we're now into a year later, perhaps a year or so later, we're into a bit of a disappointment. But the guy who was elected was not from the normal, he was neither an Islamist nor was he a warlord. He was somebody who was essentially civil society backed. And also the new speaker was also somebody who was essentially from civil society. So there had been a complete change in the nature and face of the political elite within Somalia. And not only that, when the election was over, on camera, live streamed, the old president shook hands with the new president and walked off the stage, which in the context of Somalia, without somebody shooting each other or having that is pretty extraordinary. So that was a sort of the process. We're not talking about anything particularly clever, but we're talking about just making the process as transparent as possible.
And how long did that take?
Well, it was pretty concertinaed, actually, because it was reckoned that the problem was going wrong. So it was actually done over about a 2-month period.
We have another question from the audience. If you do have a question, please ask it over there. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. My question is about the issue of state. Is this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is, thank you very much for both of your presentations, is concerning the issue of stakeholders. When we think about de-radicalization, extremism, and countering extremism, there's always this question of who do we enfranchise to take this narrative, and how do we view them, and how are they viewed? Case in point, when it came to the Islamic Courts Union, for example, we viewed them not quite the same way as, say, Somalis on the ground did. Also in certain de-radicalization programs, whether specific imams are chosen versus, or muftis are selected. So I guess my question is, when it comes to picking critical stakeholders to present messages and to encourage spaces for dialogue, to counter extremism and counter radicalization, from both of your experiences, what would you say makes a good stakeholder, and how is it you encourage the stakeholder in the local and in the regional, and not make it look like you are interfering with that stakeholder space? Thank you.
Should I kick off?
There's no, as you imply by your question, there isn't an easy answer to that. I can talk about a lot of platitudes, but they're not platitudes. They're principles, I think. I know you didn't mean it, but I think it's interesting you use the language picking your stakeholders, because that to a certain extent, is an attitude of mind, and I'm not saying you have it, but just picking on that particular word. You know, we have done a lot of that in places, of picking the leaders and picking our partners, and it doesn't always work out that they're the best people to actually to work with. It's interesting. I'm not too sure whether it's relevant or not, but in Kosovo, the sort of one of the prime ministers in the second half at a very crucial period was a chap called Ramush Haradinaj, who essentially was a pretty thuggish representative of the extreme right of the KLA during the insurgency, and he'd done bad stuff. But he understood that once the war was over, you needed to engage with the Serbs because, you know, the war was over. Kosovo was only going to be independent if you basically made it a place for all citizens to work. So it wasn't an Albanian nationalist sort of ethnically clean state. It was, you know, Kosovo was a place for Roma, Serbs, everybody. That was the new thing. So he was able, because he was from the right extreme hard of the fighting, to take everybody with him. Nobody could say you didn't do it. Nobody said could say he was soft. Nobody could say that he was somehow, you know, a soft intellectual who was taking them, you know, he is a man who, you know. But what happened is it was engineered that he was removed, and he was indicted and went to The Hague because of what he'd done. Because, for understandable reasons, what he did was not seen as acceptable in the eyes of the. But that held back Kosovo emancipation of the Serbs. I mean, I was at a meeting with him when he basically said that you know, building a monument on government money to the incident which was the catalyst for the fighting. He said, we're not going to pay for that. You've got to be, you know, you've got to be mad if you think that we, as a government, you know, this is something that we have to represent all people. If you want to pay for it by public subscription, that's separate. So my point is that we, you know, sometimes the people who we like, because of our sort of observation of what we would like to see happen and how we think that they lean towards the sort of cultural mores and practices that we admire and think need to be inculcated, they're not necessarily the people who are the best people to carry your message. And I think that's the way I'd answer that question, is that we need to understand that what I was saying about using their cultural practice, mores and moral, going back to Ramush Haradinaj, his badness, if you like, in the eyes of the West came from a deeply embedded vendetta culture where families fought each other if blood was let, you know, this classic Albanian thing. That wasn't because he was necessarily a bad guy in the context, but he was brought up in a society and in a place where he fought the next family and then the Serbs drew blood in his region. So the Serbs, it was a vendetta against the Serbs that had to be satisfied. This is deeply embedded in their culture, not somehow somebody who was counter, you know, the Western value. I mean, I've probably said enough. You understand the point I'm making. We need to understand who are the people who are able to make this change, and often those people sit in the places that we least actually want to talk to.
Well, Simon clearly acting as Ramush's publicist there. We're really bad at this. And I think that, you know, the guy who's locked away in the bowels of the State Department that knows about South Ossetia or whether it is, really does need to be consulted on an occasional basis. Ahmed Chalabi was the CIA's guy in Iraq. This was a man that was going to come and play the role of Karzai, indicted for embezzlement in Jordan. I mean, all sorts of things associated with name. How is it possible that any form of scrutiny allowed this guy to get through? So we're pretty bad. We have been historically pretty bad at identifying the essential stakeholders. But I think the real answer to your question, and it's almost a paraphrase of what Simon has just said, is that the real stakeholders are the people. You know, it is the people who can only endow the process with final legitimacy. And therefore, whatever stakeholders you look for don't necessarily need to have an identity in their own right. They simply need to be a conduit which engages in a process which reaches out to the people, which then, only with their agreement, are political solutions in any way viable in the long term. That's a difficult thing to do sometimes. I mean, lots of stakeholders are very, very self-advertising, and smaller minority groups can be extremely vocal. It is seeing through that process and seeing what are the links between government at the top, the people at the bottom, to be conjoined in a relationship which gives legitimacy to the one and representation to the other. That sounds like 1776, doesn't it? But I mean, you get what I mean.
Perhaps we could take 2 questions from both of you standing up, and then you can address both the questions and the response.
So I'm just curious with respect to this concept of working within local cultures to sort of create relevant strategies. How much time and sort of what are the approaches in sort of assessing the background noise when it comes to media-saturated environments? And I'm specifically interested in sort of the commercial media sector and cultural exports. How do you go about assessing that and implementing that in a way that considers, you know, what media, what communications people are exposed to?
If you could hand the microphone.
Thanks. Bruce Gregory, thanks for coming a long way to talk to us this morning. First question is for Sir Robert. You said in your overview that the U.S. Shouldn't reduce the scale of its ambitions, if I understood you. And my reading of British history for the last 100 years or so is that's precisely what you've been doing. And I was wondering why you would want to assert categorically that the U.S. should not do that. The second question goes to the compelling argument you make that deep comprehension of others is critical for your strategy. And practitioners don't do that. They'd rather act than understand something. Lawmakers pay lip service to it, but they don't put the resources into doing it. So I guess, how do you convince Albany associates, soldiers, diplomats, political leaders that this is precisely what they need to do, particularly in crisis situations, to be successful?
Maybe I'll start with that and answer the question you specifically directed to me, and then I'll offer something on the back end. I think that the American phrase is "I misspoke." I don't think that you. I don't think you should not reduce your scale of strategic ambition, but I do think that there is an irreducible level of strategic ambition that you have to have, given the role of the United States in the world. And you can't walk away from all of that. If you do walk away from that, you will fail some of your partners, and you will also fail yourselves. So this is not about maintaining sets of strategic ambitions forever and ever. It's about shaping them as time goes on. But I think that you have responsibilities that you cannot walk away from. And I think your dilemma is reconciling the scale of responsibility with the scale of capacity to address that responsibility. And I think you might need to look at new and more subtle combinations of the way in which that goes. I think practitioners do exactly what you say. I think that in many ways, although both of us come from military backgrounds, it's the most inappropriate for this sort of game. Because in many ways, soldiers often talk in the language of effects. And to that extent, a nuclear strike and a piece of subtle communication falls into the same bracket. It's all about a certain degree of ordnance of different natures having a certain effect in the target area. That tends to lead you to the conclusion that the discharge of high volumes of ammunition, be that artillery rounds or clever messages, is what brings about is what successfully conveys a message. It is not. What you really need to have is highly targeted messaging with a capacity to assess the effect at the other end. And in that sense, messaging needs to be discriminate, and it needs to be fairly sparing in order to have some chance of being properly assessed in a constantly circular process of sending this stuff out, analyzing the effect that it has, and then reconfirming or doing whatever you want to do. So in many ways, I think we're the backgrounds from which we come of the very worst for the responsibilities which we now hope to have. I think I would say on our behalf that we understand that, and we try and mitigate accordingly.
It'd be very difficult for me to answer your question because I tend not to operate in my experience tends to be not operating in the sort of mass media markets necessarily, and it may be something that you could speak to a bit more. But it raises a sort of mutually sort of complementary point between your question and the other one, is that it's this question about understanding, because I'm the first to prepare to admit that I wouldn't even necessarily say I'm a digital immigrant. I'm a sort of, I'm still waiting on Ellis Island, I think, in terms of that. And so it's a question of actually getting people in the system who you do have this will begin to solve itself out as people who are genuinely digital natives, rise through the system. Because I think it is quite difficult. I know it's important. I know I need to have people around me who understand it. So my answer to my question is that I would understand the problem, and I would find somebody who could help me find a solution, because I don't understand the answer sufficiently well to give you a concrete answer. Which also goes back, which is the way that connects to your point, because I think how do you get people to understand this sort of approach to understanding? And the military, it's quite interesting, because the military has a system, at least there, where it has something happens, it tries to learn from that, it then looks at it and creates a doctrine, and then it takes that doctrine and puts it back into the training system, which then finds its way through. And it refers a bit to Rob's analogy, this ability to constantly reinvent yourself. I think in the military context, that sometimes has a disadvantage to it, again, what Rob was saying about making it too rigid and too mechanical. But I think diplomacy and politics doesn't necessarily have that sort of process of this secular, taking experience, putting it in. And I think we spoke at the beginning that the fact British diplomats are not trained. They don't go on a they have a series of courses that they might go on career courses, but you go in and you want to be a foreign service officer in the UK, and I don't know what the State Department does, and you take an exam, and it's supposed to be an extremely hard and difficult exam, and everybody's very pleased and proud of themselves when they passed it, and that qualifies them to sort of launch themselves into Azerbaijan as a qualified diplomat. So I think that when you look at the military, on the other hand, they have a sort of a period of training, they have very definitive training periods throughout their career. It's a machine that's, in a way the military is training all the time to do something that nobody wants it to do. Diplomats are never trained to do the stuff they're doing all the time. And I think that's the polarity that you've got to reverse.
Can I just add to something to that? Because this is a sort of fun bit of the debate. We're really talking about understanding the operating environments in which we want to go. Part of our problem is understanding the operating environments from which we come. Strategy is all about the combination of all instruments of national power against clearly defined objectives. But the cultures within which soldiers operate are profoundly material. It is about creating a material existential outcome. The environment within which diplomats operate is essentially an abstract and intellectual one. These are two completely different frames of reference, which is why soldiers are obsessed by measuring things, volumes, and everything else, and diplomats are more interested in abstractions and concepts. And unless you can actually find some form of mutual simultaneous translation between two different tribes and two different languages, the ability to actually construct strategy is an extremely difficult thing to do.
You're obviously not you're a digital immigrant like me.
Maybe it's better. Okay, I'd like to say thank you. It's many fascinating observations. And on so many levels. But I want to get back to what you said about the notion of the soft power that counts as the local soft power. And most of us were raised, at least the older people, to Gregory, in the Cold War context, where it's kind of like the old bear story. It was just us versus the Soviet Union. It's like the two men running from the bear. I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. For that story. And so we were basically, the competition was with the Soviet Union. And that's how we were funded, that's how we justified ourselves to Congress. But in reality, when you put someone in the field, they end up being themselves. You know, who you are speaks so loud, I can't hear what you're saying. And then to go on about what you said, something about the stories are more important than the messaging, which I would say bravo, because I haven't heard the term Praetorian Guard applied to our PAOs. But the whole notion of maybe messaging doesn't count at all. I might toss that back at you and say that if we're looking for a story, and if we're not, in a place like Somalia or Mali, where there is no significant American presence, where the colonial presence was something other than U.S., and our military footprint is relatively minor, we're not really part of the narrative, and maybe we should be looking for which story. And here's the problem, because we have our back end and our capitals that are controlling our funding, but which story is going to produce the outcome long term that we really care about? And should we not really be looking, in fact, to identifying which story out there is going to create the end effect that we would like to have? And it's not about messaging at all.
Do you want to start?
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're not even furiously agreeing with I mean, I think that I mean, looking for the stories which are the local stories which support I mean, I think somehow we've got always, the Cold War thing is a good example in the sense that it's a competition between ideologies. Now, some people say that perhaps we're in a competition of ideologies, in the war on terror. I'm not entirely sure that's true. But what I think we're looking for is stable political systems in these places, which are friendly, at least, and certainly not hostile. And it's something you were saying before. We don't necessarily need to have these people love us, but what we don't want them to do is to hate us sufficiently that they're prepared to do bad things against us. So it's about creating stability in these places. I'm quoting you directly, so and which I rather like. That I mean, that's a good way of putting it. So therefore, in order to do that, you need to use the local stories of stability. I mean, again, a quick anecdote about Somalia. I mean, we sat down. We believe in drawing a narrative up. Formally drawing a narrative that actually encapsulates the phase of the political process that you're involved in, because that is the story that you want to tell. Now, the importance of making that is that story has to be, therefore, it's not our story, it's their story. So what we do is we sit down with as many the politicians, civil society people, in the awful workshops. Everybody hates another bloody workshop. But we sit around in a sort of workshop environment and actually go through a process where we try to extract what they see as the narrative. So in other words, their words, their terminology. So you build something which is actually resonant with their aspirations and all the rest of it. And again, it's a sort of similar thing to the Ramage thing. All of a sudden, something comes out which we think, oh my goodness, that's not our idea of what. Because I asked the Somalis on the first narrative exercise we did, okay, give me an image. What's an image of stability in Somalia? What is peace, security, and the Somali way in Somalia? What's an image of it? And they said, yeah, it's quite simple. It's the men sitting on mats, drinking tea, chewing cat, and telling stories, and it's the women in the fields working. Now, that is not something that we in the West would want to see as a sort of but that's what
What are your priorities? You just said you want a stable environment.
Exactly.
It's not going to create people to attack us.
Well, that's my point. So therefore, that became the thing. But what I'm saying is that we mustn't run away from that and say, oh my goodness me, we need to socially engineer these people so that it's not like that. That's my point. So the story is men on mats and women in the fields, whether we like it or not, because that means that it's a stable piece. Now, other things about human rights, all those sort of things are the longer term. I'm not saying they shouldn't be aspirational. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not making a comment on it. But what I'm saying is you can't fix everything all at the same time.
But to go back
You
to
know.
the Cold War, for years they funded us for the messaging.
Yeah.
And in fact, many would argue, our long-term impact was in fact being there. We would be arguing about you should not let the Soviets put intermediate, or we should put intermediate range missiles in your butt. I mean, nobody cared in most of the third world. But meanwhile, you're sitting there, you're running scholarship programs and exchange programs. And over time, they begin to know there are these people called the Americans or the British or the French. And they do these nice things. And then you have your educated elites come back. There's a certain attraction. They gradually bring these ideas and values back in. Okay? But your messaging, I'm pointing out, had very little to do with it. And in fact, short term, you put your how can you help the one story succeed? Military intervention, money. One of the reasons Shabab and AQM and the rest of them are getting money from other places. That money interferes with the balance of forces in a country, and it upsets the equilibrium. And then you have it. So we get involved. The reason you listen to the story is not that we're going to take over and then message based upon what they've told us. It's just so we can pick our horse. Don't you think?
Can I have a crack? Sort of give Simon a rest for a second. The Cold War, the halcyon days of mutually assured destruction. How we miss all the clarity of that stuff. But if soft power has any historical triumph, it probably is the Cold War. And as Simon said, all effects finally are local. In a sense, I think that the evidence of the Cold War, and when Joe Nye was really refining these ideas, it's about an awful lot of individual citizens in the Soviet Union and elsewhere making their minds up that there was a better way of doing these things. And I think that reduced it, not just to a local level, but to an individual level. At a given point, the individual mass became so critical that it was able to overturn the system, either by direct intervention or by so flavoring the internal political debate within those countries that it brought those things about. This whole thing of messaging, I think messaging is such a poor idea. Because it doesn't imply any sort of dialogue. It implies pressing a button and sending something out with no sense of what the impact is, where that lands, of where it actually lands, and whether the consequences are either good for what you're trying to do or bad for what you're trying to do.
But in a certain sense, advertising was born back at a time when you didn't have two-way communication. And in effect, perhaps that whole concept, back in 1924, 1934, whatever, in those days, they began to have mass media that could put messages out.
Yeah.
You didn't really have any effective means to be getting the messages back, and so that, for its time, was something.
Yeah, you had elections.
It probably was for its time, but it's not good enough now. And the way in which an example of this is the Syrian opposition. These people have been nominated. They're not the product of any internal process, that they represent the people in Syria. The only chance that the Syria opposition has of representing the people of Syria, if somehow we can link what they say to what the people in Syria actually feel. So this circular, self-reinforcing process where the message must be the sentiment, and then the sentiment affects the message, and you then get this process going round and round. Messaging, in the sense that I've said something today, I've tweeted, that is going to be picked up and universally understood, is not a sufficient device.
We have a final question here because we're a little over on time, so thank you for your patience.
Yeah, well, it's an honor to be the final question. Just very quickly, strategic communication, or STRATCOM, used to be one of the major lines of effort in Afghanistan.
Take two.
I'm sure we can hear.
We can hear.
That's their problem. The main point was that STRATCOM used to be one of the major lines of effort in Afghanistan, and I believe about 2 or 3 years ago they said, we are going to drop that term, we no longer want it to be a part of our thing, and the reason was because they could not operationalize as fast as the bad guys could, because of multiple clearance processes, trying to define the message, making sure you didn't step on some other kind of thing like that. Do you have any magic bullet for dealing with the sort of slowness, inherent slowness, and legitimate slowness of our clearance processes and so on, in order for the real effects of STRATCOM to be achieved?
Yeah, I've got something on this, but Simon has got very clearly defined views on the phrase strategic communications.
I've always found strategic communications a difficult concept because it's never. I mean, everybody has a different definition for it, and it's become something that's captured by various groups as it is. The Praetorian Guard thing again. It's the thing that it's it's the standard of the Praetorian Guard, and we take a very different approach. We have deliberately come up with a term, not to reinvent a term, but to sort of to dispense with all the sort of other terms, which is comprehensive communications, based on the point that it's an all-encompassing activity, and it's not a specific doctrinal thing. And we've written about it, and what sort of things constitute comprehensive communication. And the comprehensive communications is an attitude of mind rather than a doctrine. And I think that's the point. I think we all need to understand that this is not about processes and disciplines and doctrines in that sense. There's obviously, like in everything, there's places for that. You've got to do stuff, and you've got to have systems to enable you to deliver stuff. But the first thing is an attitude of mind, and that attitude of mind is that it's, there's the relationship between policy, delivery, and effect is about communications and persuasion. And if you don't understand that from the very beginning, which is what a politician should intrinsically understand from the outset, then you're going to have a problem. So if you want, it's about getting people to. It goes back to Joseph Nye and his whole business, getting the policy of attraction, getting people to want the things that you want, persuading them that they could want the things that you want. Attraction rather than coercion. That sort of, and so it's an attitude of mind. So it goes back to. There is no magic silver bullet for this. I mean, it's an educational thing. It's a training thing. It's a mindset thing. I mean, it goes right down to the whole business of the social media challenge, which is that you can't have a hierarchical structure in order to compete with the social media challenge presented by some of these groups. You need to adopt a different attitude of mind, which means that you can have defined boundaries. But people at a lower level need to have the confidence and trust in people at lower levels to actually act rapidly and quickly within a set of predefined narrative structures. That's why I think the first starting point is to sit down and draw this narrative out, because then you have some form of intellectual basis upon which to enable people to use social media within the confines of their own experience as it refers to that particular piece of the narrative. Gowing talks often about this whole business of the tyranny of real time, and it shows you that you know the same sort of the information that the Prime Minister or the President knows at the same time that he knows it, which is the difference between the 1920s scenario and now. You can afford to have a much slower, more sort of, because in those days, the hierarchy was the hierarchy. It was the possessor of all knowledge. It was the possessor of all, and it sort of was able to sort of dispense this because it had the information much more cohesively and controlled. Now, everybody knows everything at the same time as the people that are trying to make decisions.
And I think that then leads to a certain. You need to draw some conclusions about that. Mm-hmm. If you get caught in the ping pong game between we did this, you did that, we did this, you did that, you're almost certainly going to lose. I mean, the Brits in Northern Ireland for most of the 1970s constantly chasing the IRA, trying to get a better story out. They don't have to tell the truth. They don't have to go through processes of internal release. You're always going to be doing it slower than they're going to be doing it. Now, the fact that they lied 3 weeks ago is lost because we're in a different ping pong match now, and you're constantly going to be chasing that thing. So if you're going to fight wars, fight them on ground of your own choosing. Recognize that you've got to do something about that. But do not become preoccupied by what is a tactical engagement at the expense of a strategic outcome. The strategic outcome is about relating to what your political and any other mandated leader says has a relationship with what is happening on the ground. That is finally what really convinces people that they can invest trust in what you are saying. And I think that the people who primarily get involved with the ping pong ball are probably, let's call it a tennis match. It's the officials, who are seeing whether the ball is in or out. It's not the crowd looking on. In a sense, they happen to be there, but it's just one of the pieces of noise that is happening in that day. What they're really looking for is substantive and existential improvements in their way of life. And what the communications challenge is making sure that what is happening is reflected in what the leaders that we are supporting actually say.
And on behalf of the Institute for Public Diplomacy and Global Communication, thank you very much for speaking to us today. Please join me in thanking them.